The letter had arrived at the palace on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Charles understood that his son had crossed a line that could no longer be uncrossed, not metaphorically, literally. In writing, documented, permanent. The words were carefully chosen, every phrase calibrated to wound without appearing explicitly cruel. Harry had mastered the language of institutional betrayal, the art of criticism that sounded like concern, the technique of public exposure disguised as private appeal. But the letter itself was the point. Harry had written it to Charles directly, and then he had released it to the media before his father could even formulate a response. The betrayal wasn't the letter. It was the deliberate choice to humiliate Charles by making him learn about his son's accusations from news outlets rather than from the letter itself. Charles had read it once, then again, his hand trembling slightly as he absorbed what Harry had documented. The claims about emotional neglect during Harry's childhood. The accusations about Charles choosing the institution over his children. The narrative that positioned the king not as a man trying to balance duty and family, but as a cold, distant father who had sacrificed his relationships on the altar of constitutional obligation. None of it was entirely false. That was what made it devastating. Charles had struggled with those exact tensions. He had made decisions that prioritized the monarchy over his children's comfort. He had allowed duty to override warmth, protocol to supersede affection. But seeing it documented in his son's hand, reading it in a press statement before he had any chance to respond, understanding that Harry had deliberately chosen to humiliate him publicly, was something else entirely. Before we explore what happened next, and how Charles's response reveals the true cost of the institutional changes he's been forced to make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. This moment changes how the entire family moves forward. The letter itself was 14 pages, handwritten, which made it worse because it suggested intimacy while actually demonstrating betrayal. Harry had taken time to write it. He had chosen each word carefully. And then he had chosen to publish it without warning, without consultation, without giving his father any opportunity to respond before the narrative was already being dissected by every media outlet in the world. Charles had called his communications team immediately, not to craft a response, but to understand what exactly Harry had said that he hadn't heard directly. That was when the full scope of the betrayal had become clear. Harry hadn't just written to his father, he had written to a journalist, he had provided context, he had explained his reasoning. He had positioned himself as the vulnerable victim of an absent parent, and positioned Charles as the architect of his own suffering. The king had done something no one at the palace had ever seen him do. He had left his office in the middle of the day without explanation and gone to his private residence, not to Charles's main residence, to a smaller, more isolated location where he could think without observation. His staff had understood not to follow. When William had learned what was happening, his first instinct had been to go to his father. But Anne had stopped him. The princess had understood something about this moment that William hadn't yet fully absorbed. Charles needed to feel the weight of what his son had done without any immediate family support softening the blow. Because once Charles emerged from this moment, his response would determine whether the institutional restructuring he had begun could survive an external threat of this magnitude. Harry's letter had attacked the very foundation Charles was trying to rebuild. It had positioned institutional duty as the enemy of family love. It had suggested that Charles had chosen the crown over his children. And it had done all of this in a way that made Charles's current efforts to enforce boundaries look like further evidence of his emotional distance. The contradiction was cruel in its precision. Charles had spent the last weeks trying to establish that duty sometimes requires sacrifice, that boundaries protect relationships rather than damage them, that the institution matters because without institutional integrity, families cannot function, and Harry's letter argued the exact opposite. It argued that Charles had sacrificed his children on the altar of duty, that his current boundary setting was evidence of his continued emotional unavailability, that the king was choosing the institution over his family even now. When the journalist released the full interview with Harry, Charles finally understood the full scope of his son's calculation. Harry hadn't just written a letter to his father, he had constructed a narrative about his father. He had positioned himself as the truth-teller, the vulnerable one, the person trying to heal a relationship that Charles had damaged through years of emotional neglect. The timing was devastating. It came exactly at the moment when Charles was trying to enforce the emergency delegation. Exactly when he was asking his family to accept boundaries that felt restrictive. Exactly when Camilla was testing those boundaries and people were asking whether the institutional restructuring was sustainable. And Harry's letter suggested that it wasn't. That Charles couldn't be trusted with family relationships because he had already proven he didn't value them. That institutional duty had corrupted him so completely that he could no longer function as a father. The private response when it came surprised everyone who heard about it. Charles had not released a statement. He had not called for dialogue. He had not attempted to defend himself or explain his perspective. Instead, he had done something far more significant. He had called William, not to discuss Harry, but to discuss what Harry's letter meant for the institutional restructuring William had been implementing. Charles had told his son directly, "He's right about some of it. I have chosen duty over comfort. I have made decisions that prioritize the institution over his feelings. And I'm still going to do that because it's what being king requires." William had listened without interrupting. When his father finished, William had asked the question that mattered. "Does this change your commitment to the boundaries we've established?" Charles had been silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something William had rarely heard from him. Not defensiveness, clarity. "No, it makes me more committed to them." Because if Harry had understood that duty and family aren't opposites, if he understood that boundaries exist to protect relationships rather than damage them, we might not be in this situation. It was the most direct acknowledgement Charles had yet made. His son had suffered because Charles had failed to establish clear boundaries between his personal life and his institutional role. Harry had grown up watching his father struggle with that balance, and Harry had concluded that his father had chosen the institution. The letter was the result of that misunderstanding, and the only way to prevent similar misunderstandings with his other children was to make absolutely clear that boundaries were not evidence of emotional distance. They were evidence of institutional responsibility. Anne had heard about Charles's response through William, and she had understood immediately what her brother had accomplished through his conversation with his son. He had taken Harry's attack and transformed it into evidence for why the emergency delegation was necessary. He had turned his own failure as a father into a lesson about why institutional structure mattered. He had admitted the painful truth that he had chosen duty over comfort, and then positioned that choice as the reason why his current boundaries were not just necessary, but essential. The palace began preparing a response to Harry's letter, not a defensive statement, but a clarification. The communications team drafted language that acknowledged the legitimate aspects of Harry's criticism while maintaining that the institutional changes Charles was implementing were designed to prevent similar misunderstandings with the next generation. It was a delicate balance. Charles wasn't defending his past choices, he was explaining why those choices had been mistakes, and why he was committed to preventing future generations from experiencing similar pain. What emerged was a statement that surprised many observers. Instead of attacking Harry, Charles had essentially agreed with the core of his son's criticism while explaining that the institutional restructuring was designed to address exactly the problems Harry had identified. He had written in a personal note to Harry, one that he released only after careful consultation with William, that he understood why his son felt abandoned, that he took responsibility for prioritizing duty over emotional availability, and that the boundaries he was now establishing were designed to ensure that his other children would never experience similar pain. It was a remarkable moment. A king essentially admitting that he had failed as a father while simultaneously explaining that his current institutional role was an attempt to rectify those failures. The response had accomplished something that seemed impossible. It had taken Harry's attack and transformed it into evidence supporting Charles's entire restructuring agenda. It had positioned the king not as cold and distant, but as a man learning from his mistakes and trying to prevent his children from experiencing similar pain. Camilla had watched this unfold, with an expression that revealed her own understanding of what was happening. Charles was finally being forced to confront the cost of his choices. The emergency delegation, the boundaries around her influence, the institutional restructuring that had displaced her from the informal corridors of power, all of it was the consequence of Charles's past failures as a father. And now, ironically, those same failures were giving him moral authority to enforce the very boundaries that Camilla had been testing. Harry's letter had backfired. Instead of weakening Charles's position, it had strengthened it. Instead of making the institutional restructuring look like further evidence of emotional distance, It had made it look like evidence of growth, like a king finally learning the lessons his son had tried to teach him. The private response Charles had given to William, the personal letter to Harry, the institutional statement that acknowledged legitimate criticism while explaining institutional necessity, all of it had combined to transform a potential crisis into an opportunity for Charles to demonstrate that he understood the stakes of what he was trying to do. Anne had spoken to Charles after the statement was released. The princess had acknowledged what everyone was beginning to understand, that Harry's letter, intended as an attack, had actually clarified something essential about why the emergency delegation was necessary. It had demonstrated exactly the kind of fracture that institutional boundaries were designed to prevent. It had shown what happened when family relationships weren't protected by clear institutional structure, and it had given Charles the moral authority to enforce boundaries in ways that his past failures had previously undermined. The king had listened to his sister without defending himself further. He had simply nodded, understanding that the institutional restructuring he had begun was no longer just about protecting William's future or constraining Camilla's influence. It was about learning from the mistakes that had cost him his relationship with Harry. It was about ensuring that his other children would never experience the same sense of abandonment. It was about building a monarchy where institutional duty and family love were no longer positioned as opposites, but as complementary forces. Days later, William had met with his father to discuss what came next: how to respond to Harry if he escalated, how to maintain boundaries without appearing cold, how to enforce institutional structure while also demonstrating genuine family care. Charles had answered with something approaching peace. "We've already shown him the answer," the king had said. "Not through words, but through actions, through boundaries that exist to protect, not to exclude, through institutional structure that serves family rather than destroying it." The crisis that Harry's letter had created had resolved not through counterattack or defense, but through institutional clarity. Charles had taken his son's accusations, acknowledged the legitimate elements, and explained how the current restructuring was designed to address exactly those problems. He had transformed personal failure into institutional learning, and in doing so, he had given the entire palace a framework for understanding why the emergency delegation was necessary, not because Charles was power-hungry, but because he had learned through painful experience that institutional structure was essential to protecting family relationships. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.